April 12, 1945. The northern coast of Germany. A U.S. Navy transport vessel dropped anchor 300 meters from shore. German women stood on the dunes watching the landing craft approach. They had been told American soldiers were coming. They had not been told which ones. The first wave of troops disembarked. The women froze. The soldiers stepping onto German soil were black. For 12 years, Nazi propaganda had told these women what to expect from such an encounter. Now that encounter was happening. In the next 72 hours, everything they believed would be tested against reality. What happened next would force both sides to confront something neither was prepared for: the cost of seeing each other as human. Stories like this deserve to be remembered. If you want to uncover more hidden moments of history, subscribe to Battlefront Insider and turn on notifications. 3 weeks earlier, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine. By early April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing from both ends. Soviet armies pushed from the east. American, British, and Canadian forces advanced from the west. Germany's industrial heartland was burning. The Ruhr Valley, once the engine of Nazi war production, had been bombed into submission. Factories that once produced tanks now stood silent, their roofs open to the sky. The German workforce had changed. By 1945, nearly 7 million German men were dead, captured, or fighting at the front. Women had taken their places. They operated the lathes. They sorted the munitions. They kept the Reich's infrastructure from total collapse. These women had been indoctrinated. The Nazi Party had spent over a decade teaching racial hierarchy as scientific fact. Black people existed at the bottom of that hierarchy, portrayed as primitive, dangerous, subhuman. Now the war was coming to their doorstep, and with it, the soldiers they had been taught to fear most. The United States Army in 1945 was segregated. Black soldiers served in separate units, often relegated to support roles. But several black combat units had proven themselves in Italy and France. The 761st Tank Battalion had fought through the Ardennes. The 92nd Infantry Division had taken casualties in the Italian mountains. By April, some of these units were pushing into Germany itself. The German women waiting on the coast had never seen a black person in their lives. Their only reference points were propaganda posters and newsreels designed to dehumanize. They had been told what to expect. They were about to learn how wrong those expectations were. The landing craft continued toward shore. The first black soldiers reached the beach. German civilians watched from behind closed windows. Some had fled inland. Others stayed either by choice or necessity. The problem was immediate and mutual. For the German women, every instinct trained into them screamed danger. The propaganda had been relentless. Years of it. Posters showing exaggerated caricatures. Radio broadcasts warning of violence. School lessons teaching biological inferiority. Now those abstractions had faces. Young men in American uniforms carrying rifles, speaking English, walking through their streets. For the black soldiers, the problem was different but equally acute. They had fought across Europe, endured discrimination within their own army, and now faced a population that had been explicitly taught to hate them. They knew what German propaganda said about black Americans. They knew the risks. Command had briefed them. Minimal contact with civilians. No fraternization. Complete the mission. Move out. But war does not allow for clean separation. The soldiers needed information about German troop movements. They needed to secure infrastructure. They needed cooperation, or at least compliance, from the local population. The German women needed assurance that they would not be harmed. They needed to understand the new power structure. They needed to navigate occupation without losing what little stability remained. Neither side could avoid the other. Then the first direct encounters began. A black soldier knocked on a door, asking in broken German about the location of retreating Wehrmacht units. The woman who answered trembled visibly. She had a child behind her. She gave the information and closed the door. Another soldier approached a group of women at a communal well. They scattered. One dropped her bucket. The soldier picked it up, set it down, and walked away. These were not violent encounters. But they carried the weight of collision between two realities that had been built never to meet. The German authorities, what remained of them, issued warnings. Do not cooperate with occupation forces. Maintain dignity. Remember who you are. The American command issued its own orders. Maintain discipline. No personal relationships. Focus on securing the sector. But orders cannot control human reaction. The women were terrified. The soldiers were wary. And both groups were about to discover that propaganda is a poor substitute for direct experience. By 1100 hours, the tension had not broken. It had simply settled into watchful silence. In the remains of a bombed apartment block 15 kilometers inland, a German woman named Margarete Schroeder knelt in rubble that had been her home. Her husband had died at Stalingrad. Her eldest son had been conscripted at 16 and never returned. Her youngest daughter had been killed in an air raid 2 months earlier. Margarete was 41 years old. She had nothing left except a photograph and a small bag of belongings. At the same moment, 300 kilometers to the south, Private James Calloway of the 761st Tank Battalion was writing a letter home to Georgia. He had survived the Battle of the Bulge. He had watched friends die in tank battles across France. He had fought for a country that still denied him the right to vote. He wrote about the cold. He wrote about missing his mother's cooking. He did not write about the fear that never left him, even in moments of calm. These were the human costs of the war by April 1945. Not just the deaths, though those were staggering, but the accumulated weight of loss, fear, and exhaustion that every person carried. The German women had lost husbands, brothers, sons. They had survived bombings. They had worked 12-hour shifts in factories producing weapons for a war they could no longer win. They had watched their cities burn. The black American soldiers had crossed an ocean to fight fascism while living under segregation. They had proven themselves in combat while being denied equal treatment in their own army. They had liberated concentration camps and witnessed the depths of Nazi atrocity, knowing they would return home to Jim Crow. By 1,327 hours, the two groups began to encounter each other more frequently. In a town square in Lower Saxony, a black supply unit set up a distribution point. German civilians, mostly women and children, lined up for food. The interactions were brief, transactional, silent. One woman fainted from hunger while waiting in line. An American medic, a black soldier from Alabama, caught her before she hit the ground. He called for water. He checked her pulse. He spoke to her in English she did not understand, but his tone was calm. When she revived, she looked at him. Actually looked at him. And for the first time, the propaganda image in her mind did not match the reality in front of her. The human cost of the war had created this moment. Desperation on one side, compassion on the other. Neither side could afford the luxury of ideology when survival was at stake. If stories like this change how you see history, help us bring more of them to light. Subscribe to Battlefront Insider. More cracks appeared in the wall of fear. A German factory worker named Anna traded information about a destroyed bridge for medical supplies for her sick mother. A black sergeant shared his rations with a group of German children who had been orphaned in the bombings. These were not grand gestures. They were small acts of recognition, human to human. In a war that had tried to erase such recognition entirely, the cost of the war was measured in lives lost, but also in the slow, painful realization that the enemy you had been taught to hate was simply another person trying to survive. A German woman named Elisabeth Hoffmann stood at a decision point. She was a forewoman at a now-defunct munitions factory. She had supervised 200 workers. She had believed in Germany's cause, or at least had convinced herself she did. Now she stood in the kitchen of a half-destroyed house, looking at a black American soldier who had asked her a direct question. Would she help identify which roads were still passable for Allied vehicles? The question was simple. The answer was not. If she helped, she would be betraying what remained of German resistance. The local Nazi officials, though their power was crumbling, still kept lists. Collaborators would be remembered. If she refused, the Americans would simply move forward without her information. Men on both sides might die unnecessarily, including the soldiers now standing in her kitchen, who had done nothing to her except ask for help. Elizabeth had spent 12 years absorbing Nazi ideology. She had attended party meetings. She had contributed to war bond drives. She had believed what she was told about racial hierarchies. But 12 years of propaganda had not prepared her for this. A black soldier treating her with respect, speaking to her as an equal, asking, not demanding. The soldier's name was Corporal Marcus Williams. He was from Detroit. He had fought in France. He was 23 years old and exhausted. He did not threaten Elizabeth. He did not plead. He simply explained that better information meant fewer casualties. For everyone. Elizabeth made her choice at 1,742 hours. She drew a rough map on a piece of paper. She marked where bridges had collapsed. She indicated which roads still had intact pavement. She did not do this because she suddenly rejected everything she had believed. She did this because the man in front of her was clearly human, clearly tired, and clearly trying to end the war with as little additional bloodshed as possible. The moral crossroad was not dramatic. There was no speech, no moment of revelation. Just a middle-aged German woman deciding that helping people survive was more important than maintaining ideological purity. Corporal Williams thanked her. He folded the map. He left. Elizabeth sat down and waited to see if she would be reported. Word had spread quietly among other German women in the area. The Americans were asking questions. They were not brutal. They were not what the propaganda had promised. Other women made similar choices. A farmer's widow indicated where German soldiers had retreated. A teacher identified which buildings were structurally unsafe. A nurse offered to help treat wounded soldiers from both sides. These were not acts of heroism. They were acts of pragmatism, laced with the first stirrings of doubt about everything they had been taught. The moral crossroad was not a single moment. It was a series of small decisions made by ordinary people who chose immediate humanity over abstract ideology. The war would end soon. But the consequences of these choices would outlast the peace treaty. Elizabeth Hoffman was about to take a much bigger risk. She had provided the map. That had been relatively safe. But now Corporal Williams had returned with a different request. American intelligence believed a small group of German soldiers were holding out in a factory complex 2 kilometers north. The Americans planned to assault the position at dawn. Williams estimated casualties on both sides would be high. He asked Elizabeth if she could make contact with the German soldiers. Convince them to surrender. Avoid the bloodshed entirely. This was no longer simply providing information. This was active intervention. If the German soldiers reported her, she could be executed for treason. Elizabeth asked for 1 hour to think. She made her decision. She would try. She knew one of the soldiers in the factory. A young man named Klaus, barely 18, who had worked briefly under her supervision before conscription. If anyone would listen to reason, it might be him. Elizabeth walked through the darkness toward the factory. No street lights. No moon. Just the sound of distant artillery and her own footsteps on broken pavement. If stories like this reveal courage in unexpected places, help us share them. Subscribe to Battlefront Insider. She reached the factory perimeter at 2,147 hours. German voices challenged her. She identified herself. She asked to speak with Klaus. He came to the fence. 19 years old now, she realized. Dirty uniform. Hollow eyes. She told him the truth. The Americans were coming at dawn. His unit was outnumbered and outgunned. He could fight and die, or he could surrender and live. Klaus did not respond immediately. Behind him, his commanding officer was shouting orders. The officer was a true believer, one of the last, still convinced the Reich would rally. Elizabeth made her final argument. She told Klaus that the war was over. That dying for a collapsed cause would not bring back the Germany they had known. That his mother, if she was still alive, would want him to survive. Klaus looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Klaus and 3 other soldiers slipped away from their unit. They surrendered to the American position before dawn. The rest of the unit, under the command of the ideological officer, fought at 0530 hours. The battle lasted 17 minutes. All remaining German soldiers were killed. No American casualties. Elizabeth had saved 4 lives. The act would never appear in any official record. April 13th. The assault began exactly as planned, minus the 4 soldiers who had deserted overnight. The German officer commanding the holdout had barricaded his men inside the factory's main hall. He had ammunition but no heavy weapons. He had determination but no realistic chance of survival. The American force included elements of the 761st Tank Battalion. 3 M4 Sherman tanks supported by infantry. The plan was straightforward. Shell the building until resistance ceased. Corporal Williams, who had convinced Elizabeth to intervene, was part of the infantry support. He knew 4 German soldiers had surrendered because of her. He also knew there were still at least a dozen inside the factory who had chosen to fight. The first shell hit the factory's northern wall at 0533 hours. The second hit the roof. Return fire from German positions was scattered and inaccurate. The building was burning. German soldiers began stumbling out, hands raised, coughing smoke. The officer who had refused to surrender was the last to emerge. He was wounded, defiant, and immediately began shouting about betrayal. He mentioned deserters. American soldiers restrained him. A translator arrived. The officer continued ranting about traitors who had fled during the night. Williams understood immediately. If the officer talked too much, he might identify who had helped the deserters escape. That would lead directly to Elizabeth. Williams made a decision. He approached the officer and, in front of witnesses, asked him direct questions about tactical positions and supply lines. questions that had nothing to do with deserters. The officer, focused on military details and his own grievances, answered. The conversation shifted. The topic of deserters dropped. Williams had redirected the interrogation deliberately. It was a small act, but it protected Elizabeth from exposure. The test had multiple layers. Elizabeth had tested her conscience by risking her life to save German soldiers. Klaus had tested his survival instinct against ideological loyalty. Williams had tested his commitment to protecting someone who had chosen humanity over doctrine. All three had passed. The factory was secured. The surviving German soldiers were processed as prisoners of war. The American unit prepared to move to the next objective. None of the official reports mentioned a German woman who had facilitated the desertion of 4 enemy combatants. That story remained known only to those directly involved. The test of character rarely makes it into the historical record. But it shapes outcomes nonetheless. By April 15th, the pattern had spread. What Elizabeth Hoffman had done in one town, other German women began doing in adjacent areas. Not because of coordination. Not because of orders. But because word traveled. The Americans were not what the propaganda had promised. The black soldiers, in particular, were not the monsters described in 12 years of Nazi indoctrination. They were tired young men trying to end a war. In a village near Hanover, a German schoolteacher named Greta provided information about minefields, preventing American casualties. In return, an American medical unit treated her nephew's infected leg. In a town near Brunswick, a group of German women convinced local holdouts to surrender rather than face annihilation. The Americans responded by distributing medical supplies to civilians. These interactions created a feedback loop. German women who had expected brutality encountered pragmatism. American soldiers who had expected hostility encountered cooperation. The ripple effect was not universal. Many German women still refused contact with occupation forces. Many American units maintained strict separation protocols. But enough interactions occurred to shift the dynamic from confrontation to coexistence. By April 20th, American military intelligence noted an unusual trend in their sector reports. Civilian cooperation was higher than expected. Resistance was lighter. Casualties were lower. The analysts attributed this to German exhaustion and the Reich's total collapse. They were partially correct. But they missed the underlying cause: individual decisions by ordinary people to prioritize survival over ideology. If you believe stories like this show war's hidden complexity help us bring more to light, subscribe to Battlefront Insider. The ripple effect extended beyond tactical advantages. German women who had spent years being told that black Americans were subhuman now had direct evidence to the contrary. The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some resolved it by rejecting the propaganda entirely. Others compartmentalized, separating these specific Americans from their broader beliefs. But none could fully maintain the fantasy that Nazi racial doctrine had promoted. For the black American soldiers, the ripple effect was equally significant. They had fought across Europe while being treated as second-class soldiers by their own army. Now they were experiencing something unexpected, being seen as liberators by the very people who had been taught to view them as inferior. The irony was not lost on them. They were helping to free Germany from fascism while returning home to segregation. They were being treated with respect in enemy territory while being denied basic rights in their own country. By April 25th, the war in northern Germany was effectively over. Wehrmacht units had surrendered or retreated eastward. The American forces began transitioning to occupation duties. The relationships formed during those 2 weeks in April did not vanish. Some German women and American soldiers maintained contact. Letters were exchanged. Photographs were taken. Years later, historians would note that the American occupation of northern Germany proceeded more smoothly than expected. The official explanations focused on military strategy and German exhaustion. The unofficial explanation involved thousands of small decisions made by people who chose to see each other as human beings first and enemies second. The ripple effect of those choices shaped the peace that followed. The Nazi party apparatus, even in collapse, noticed. By April 22nd, local party officials in the occupied zones began compiling lists. Women who had been seen cooperating with American forces. Women who had provided information. Women who had socialized with occupation troops. The lists were detailed. Names, addresses, descriptions of collaboration. The intent was clear. When German authority was restored, these women would face consequences. The flaw in that plan was that German authority would never be restored. The Reich had 10 days left. But the party officials did not yet accept that reality. On April 24th, One such official, a mid-level functionary named Werner Schmidt, confronted Elizabeth Hoffmann directly. He accused her of betraying Germany. He threatened her with future prosecution. Elizabeth listened calmly. Then she asked Schmidt a simple question. What exactly had she betrayed? Schmidt listed her crimes: providing maps to the enemy, facilitating desertion, cooperating with occupation forces. Elizabeth responded with her own list. She had prevented unnecessary deaths. She had helped end the war sooner in her region. She had kept her neighbors alive. Schmidt called her a traitor. Elizabeth called him obsolete. The conversation ended there. Schmidt had no power to enforce his threats. The party infrastructure was collapsing. His lists were meaningless. But the reaction revealed something important. The ideological true believers, even facing total defeat, could not accept that cooperation might have been the moral choice. They could not conceive that helping the enemy might also mean helping humanity. The American military system had its own reactions. By late April, several commanders noticed that black units in certain sectors were reporting unusually positive interactions with German civilians. This created administrative confusion. The segregated structure of the U.S. Army was built on the assumption that black soldiers required white oversight for discipline reasons. But if black units were successfully managing occupation duties, building civilian cooperation and maintaining order, that assumption became harder to justify. Some commanders responded by downplaying the reports. Others quietly noted the success but refused to draw broader conclusions. A few recognized the implications but knew that challenging military segregation in 1945 was career suicide. The systemic reaction, in other words, was to ignore evidence that contradicted doctrine. This would continue. Black soldiers would return home from Europe having served with distinction, having earned respect from German civilians, having proven themselves equal to any combat challenge. And they would return to a segregated America that denied them the freedom they had fought to defend. The enemy had reacted with denial. The system had reacted with willful blindness. The individuals involved had reacted with humanity. History would remember the systems. The individuals would be forgotten. But the individuals were the ones who made the actual difference. May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe ended. The black American soldiers who had occupied northern Germany were reassigned. Some went to occupation duty in other sectors. Others prepared to ship home. A few were redeployed to the Pacific Theater. The German women who had cooperated with them resumed their lives under Allied occupation. They rebuilt what could be rebuilt. They mourned what could not be recovered. They adapted to a new reality. The lists compiled by Nazi officials were found by American intelligence. The names on those lists were examined. But rather than face prosecution for collaboration, many of the women were recognized as having facilitated the transition to peace. Elizabeth Hoffmann continued working. By 1946, she was helping to rebuild the factory that had been destroyed in the April fighting. She never spoke publicly about her role in convincing German soldiers to surrender. She did not seek recognition. Klaus, the young soldier she had saved, survived the war and returned to his hometown. He became a schoolteacher. He taught history. When the topic of Germany's defeat came up, he would sometimes mention that the end of the war in his region had been less bloody than it might have been. He never mentioned why. Corporal Marcus Williams returned to Detroit in late 1945. He was 24 years old. He had fought across France and Germany. He had witnessed the liberation of concentration camps. He had helped occupy enemy territory. He returned to a segregated America. He could not vote in several states. He could not eat in certain restaurants. He could not live in certain neighborhoods. He found work in an auto factory. He married. He raised children. He rarely spoke about the war. In 1963, at the height of the civil rights movement, a journalist interviewing veterans asked Williams what he remembered most about Europe. Williams thought for a long moment. Then he said, "The German people treated me with more respect than my own country did when I got home." The journalist included the quote in his article. It was buried on page 6. Few people read it. The legacy of those 2 weeks in April 1945 was complicated. For the German women, it shattered the propaganda they had absorbed for 12 years. They had been told black people were subhuman. They had encountered human beings who behaved with discipline, compassion, and professionalism. That contradiction could not be ignored. It sat in their memories, a permanent challenge to the ideology they had been taught. For the black American soldiers, the experience was bittersweet. They had been liberators. They had been respected. They had performed their duties with distinction. And then they had gone home to a country that still denied them full citizenship. The historical record of this period is sparse. Official military reports mention troop movements, casualty figures, and logistical details. They rarely mention the human interactions that shaped the occupation. Elizabeth Hoffman died in 1972. Her obituary mentioned her work in factory management. It did not mention that she had saved lives by defying her own government. Marcus Williams died in 1989. His obituary mentioned his service in the 761st Tank Battalion. It did not mention the German women who had treated him with the respect his own country denied. The legacy of their encounter exists primarily in the memories of those who experienced it, and in the children and grandchildren who heard the stories secondhand. But the legacy is real. The German women who met Black American soldiers in April 1945 carried that experience forward. They raised children with different assumptions about race. They questioned propaganda more readily. They recognized humanity across lines of difference. The Black American soldiers carried their own legacy. They had proven themselves in combat. They had earned respect from former enemies. They returned home determined to claim the rights they had fought to defend. Many of them became leaders in the civil rights movement. Many of them taught their children that dignity was non-negotiable. Many of them refused to accept the segregation that America tried to reimpose. The 2 weeks in April 1945 did not change the world, but they changed the people involved. And those people in turn shaped the decades that followed. History moves through individual decisions. A woman choosing to draw a map. A soldier choosing to show compassion. A young man choosing to surrender rather than die for a lost cause. These decisions do not make headlines. They do not appear in textbooks, but they accumulate, and in accumulation they shift the world. The encounter between German women and Black American soldiers in April 1945 reveals a fundamental truth about propaganda. It only works until direct experience contradicts it. Nazi Germany spent 12 years constructing an elaborate ideology of racial hierarchy. Millions of Germans absorbed that ideology. They believed it, or at least accepted it, or at minimum did not challenge it publicly. But ideology, no matter how pervasive, is fragile when confronted with reality. The German women standing on the dunes on April 12, 1945, had been taught what to expect. They expected violence. They expected brutality. They expected confirmation of everything the propaganda had promised. They encountered tired young men trying to end a war. That single moment of disconnect was enough to crack the foundation of 12 years of indoctrination. This reveals something important about belief systems built on dehumanization. They cannot survive contact with the humanity of the people they dehumanize. The Black American soldiers faced their own contradiction. They fought for freedom while being denied freedom. They liberated others while being oppressed at home. They represented American ideals while being excluded from American equality. That contradiction would fuel the civil rights movement. The veterans who returned from Europe had seen a different possibility. They had been treated as equals even by former enemies. They would no longer accept less from their own country. The moral weight of the story is not in grand gestures. There were no dramatic speeches. No one defied their system loudly. No one became a martyr. The moral weight is in the accumulation of small choices. Elizabeth drawing a map. Marcus sharing rations. Klaus walking away from a doomed position. Hundreds of individual decisions that prioritized human survival over ideological purity. War forces people to confront essentials. When death is immediate and resources are scarce, abstractions lose their power. Race, nationality, ideology, these become secondary to the basic question: will you help me survive or harm me? The German women needed help. The American soldiers provided it, or at least did not inflict harm. That practical reality overrode years of propaganda. This does not mean the German women suddenly became anti-racist. Many retained prejudiced views. Many compartmentalized their experiences. Many distinguished between these specific soldiers and broader assumptions about race. But they could no longer maintain the complete dehumanization that Nazi propaganda required. They had seen evidence that contradicted it. That evidence could not be unseen. For the Black American soldiers, the experience validated what they had always known. Racism was a construct, not a truth. They had been treated as inferior in America. They had been treated as equals, or at least with basic respect, in Germany. The contrast was stark, and it would inform their determination to change America. The moral lesson is not that war creates understanding. War creates destruction. The moral lesson is that even in war's chaos, people can choose humanity over doctrine. Those choices matter. They do not prevent war. They do not erase atrocity, but they create small spaces where people recognize each other as human beings. Those spaces accumulate. They influence the peace that follows. They shape the next generation. The encounter in April 1945 was not unique. Similar interactions occurred across occupied Germany. Allied soldiers and German civilians navigated the transition from war to occupation through thousands of small negotiations. But the interaction between Black American soldiers and German women carried additional weight because both groups had been systematically dehumanized. The German women by Allied bombing and invasion, the Black soldiers by their own country's segregation. When two dehumanized groups encounter each other and choose mutual recognition, it disrupts the entire logic of dehumanization. That is the moral core of the story. Not that people suddenly became enlightened, but that they made practical choices that acknowledged each other's humanity, and those choices had consequences that rippled forward through time. The consequences were imperfect. They did not end racism. They did not prevent future conflicts. They did not create utopia. But they created possibility. They demonstrated that propaganda could be overcome. They showed that people could choose differently. And in the long arc of history that matters. April 12, 1945. A moment on the dunes of northern Germany. German women watching Black American soldiers step onto shore. That moment contained everything. Fear built by years of propaganda. Exhaustion from years of war. The collision of two groups who had been taught never to see each other as fully human. What happened in the hours and days that followed was not predetermined. History was not inevitable. The outcome depended on individual choices made by ordinary people facing extraordinary circumstances. They chose, more often than not, to acknowledge each other's humanity. That choice did not erase the war's horrors. It did not undo the atrocities committed. It did not solve the systemic injustices that both groups faced. But it created small spaces of recognition in the midst of chaos. Those spaces mattered to the people involved. They shaped how German women understood race. They shaped how Black American soldiers understood their own worth. They planted seeds that would grow into larger movements for justice and equality. History remembers the generals and politicians. It remembers the battles and treaties. It rarely remembers the factory forewoman who drew a map, the corporal who showed compassion, the young soldier who chose surrender over death. But these are the people who actually make history happen. Not through grand declarations, but through small decisions repeated by thousands of individuals. The story of April 1945 is their story. It deserves to be remembered not because it was unique but because it was typical. This is how people actually behave when systems collapse and ideology fails. They improvise. They adapt. They choose survival and, sometimes, compassion. The archival record of this period is incomplete. Many of the interactions were never documented. The people involved did not seek recognition. They simply lived through a moment of history and made the choices they thought were right. We preserve these stories not to glorify war but to understand it. War is not only combat and strategy. It is also the moment when a German woman decides to help, when a Black soldier shows mercy, when an 18-year-old chooses life over ideology. These moments reveal what humans are capable of when the structures that define normal life collapse. Sometimes the answer is horrifying. Sometimes the answer is surprisingly hopeful. The encounter on the dunes contained both possibilities. What unfolded was a testament to the capacity for recognition even between supposed enemies. If you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, help us keep them alive. Like, comment, and subscribe. The German women who met Black American soldiers in April 1945 are nearly all gone now. The soldiers themselves have mostly passed. The living memory of that encounter is fading. But the meaning endures. War tests humanity at its breaking point. Sometimes humanity breaks. Sometimes it bends. And sometimes, in small but significant ways, it holds. The dunes are still there. The beaches of northern Germany remain. The physical landscape has not changed much in 80 years. But the human landscape shifted in those 2 weeks of April 1945. Not dramatically. Not completely. But measurably. German women learned that propaganda lied. Black American soldiers learned that respect was possible, even from former enemies. Both groups carried those lessons forward into the post-war world. The peace that followed was imperfect. America remained segregated for another 2 decades. Germany grappled with its guilt and responsibility for the Holocaust. The soldiers and civilians who met in April 1945 returned to societies that had not yet reckoned with their own failures. But those individuals knew something their societies did not yet fully accept. That the barriers between people are constructed, not natural. That recognition across difference is possible. That humanity can persist even in war's darkest moments. That knowledge shaped their children, their grandchildren, the generations that followed. We tell this story now because it represents something essential about how change actually happens. Not through top-down declarations but through bottom-up recognition. Not through policy alone, but through countless individual decisions that accumulate into cultural shift. The story is imperfect. It does not have a tidy ending. Many of the people involved retained prejudices. Many of the systems they navigated remained unjust. Real change takes generations. But the encounter on the dunes was part of that generational process. It was one moment in a longer arc toward recognition. And it deserves to be remembered alongside the battles and treaties that dominate historical accounts. This is Battlefront Insider, where we reveal the human stories behind every war.